Late 1942. A test pilot from Britain's elite aeroplane and armament experimental establishment climbs from the cockpit of a new American fighter. The aircraft is the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and his official report will be damning. It's overweight, its low-altitude handling is sluggish, and its rate of climb is dangerously slow. To man accustomed to the nimble Spitfire, this nearly 8-ton behemoth, mockingly nicknamed the 7-ton milk bottle, is a tactical dead end. The expert verdict is in, and it's brutal. With this judgment from their closest ally, what were the Americans to do with thousands of fighters already rolling off the assembly lines? And yet, this very same aircraft would become the machine that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. This is the story of that impossible reversal, a documentary investigation into a critical, misunderstood turning point in the air war. We will uncover the secret reports, the high-stakes gambles, and the clashing military philosophies that nearly saw this war-winning weapon cast aside. But to understand how the Thunderbolt achieved its legendary status, we must first examine the crisis it was designed to solve, and why it was so thoroughly misjudged. By late 1942, the American strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. The core doctrine of the U.S. 8th Air Force, that tightly packed formations of B-17 flying fortresses could defend themselves in daylight raids over Germany, was being systematically dismantled. The theory was elegant, the reality was brutal. Luftwaffe fighters, especially the lethal Focke-Wulf 190, were learning to slash through the bomber boxes, finding blind spots and overwhelming the gunners. Loss rates were spiraling toward a level that was not just unacceptable, but unsustainable. The entire strategy was bleeding out, thousands of feet above the European continent. The most obvious solution, a fighter escort, was impossible for America's British allies. The Royal Air Force had perfected its own air power philosophy during the Battle of Britain. Its legendary Supermarine Spitfire was a masterpiece of point defense interception, designed to climb rapidly, engage enemies over home territory, and return to base. But its fuel tanks were sized for that mission. The Spitfire simply lacked the range to shepherd bombers to targets deep inside the Reich and fight its way home. Its design, its pilots, and its entire operational doctrine were defensive. This defensive mindset fundamentally shaped how the British tested new aircraft. When the RAF's elite aeroplane and armament experimental establishment evaluated the P-47, they weren't looking for a long-range escort. They were looking for a potential successor to their Spitfire. Their tests were rigorous and factually sound, based on years of combat experience over the English Channel. They measured rate of climb below 20,000 feet. They timed acceleration. They pitted it against their own fighters in mock dogfights. And in those conditions, the Thunderbolt failed spectacularly. The official reports confirmed it was dangerously sluggish. In a turning fight against AFW 190, it was helpless. Its climb rate was abysmal. Based on the data, based on every lesson the RAF had learned in 3 years of war, the conclusion was inescapable. The P-47 was unfit for European combat. This left the American command in an impossible position. Their bombing offensive was failing for lack of an escort, and their primary hope for that escort had just been professionally condemned by the most experienced Air Force in the world. Trapped between devastating losses and their allies' expert opinion, they had to make a choice: trust the data and abandon their new fighter, or find a radical way to prove the experts wrong. Frustrated by paper arguments they couldn't win, USAAF commanders in Britain decided to force the issue. They would settle it in the sky. In a series of unofficial but high-stakes demonstrations, a top American pilot from the 56th Fighter Group took his P-47 up against the pride of the RAF, a Spitfire Mark IX. The British pilot, confident in his machine's legendary turning ability, immediately tried to lure the heavy American fighter into a classic dogfight. the Spitfire's arena. But the American pilot refused the invitation. Instead, he pushed the Thunderbolt's nose down. The 8-ton fighter plunged into a dive, accelerating to a speed the lighter Spitfire physically could not match. He flashed past his opponent in a simulated firing run, then used the immense kinetic energy to execute a soaring zoom climb, converting raw speed back into altitude. The Spitfire pilot was left stunned, circling alone in an empty sky. The Thunderbolt hadn't won by playing the game. It had won by breaking the rules. This single demonstration was a shock. But could a tactic so alien to European air combat actually work in the chaos of a real battle against hundreds of German fighters? The source of that incredible diving speed and high-altitude power was a piece of engineering hidden deep within the Thunderbolt's bulky frame, a secret that the British tests had fundamentally discounted. It was called the General Electric turbo-supercharger. The system was a complex masterpiece of plumbing. A vast network of ducts ran from the engine, along the belly of the fuselage, to a turbine in the rear, and then all the way back to the front. It used the engine's own hot exhaust gases to spin a turbine at phenomenal speeds. This turbine, in turn, drove a compressor that forced dense, pressurized air back into the massive 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. This added hundreds of pounds of weight and created enormous aerodynamic drag, making the aircraft sluggish down low. But above 25,000 feet, the ceiling where the bombers flew, the turbo-supercharger transformed the P-47. While the engines of German fighters were gasping in the thin air, the Thunderbolt's engine was breathing deeply, delivering its full 2,000 horsepower. It was designed not for the low-altitude duels over the English Channel, but for the brutal, high-altitude war over the Reich. But a weapon is useless without a doctrine. When the first P-47 unit, the 56th Fighter Group, arrived in England in early 1943, that doctrine did not exist. Led by the fiercely demanding Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, his pilots were trained in classic American dogfighting tactics. They tried to turn with the nimble Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, and they were getting shot down. The learning curve was vertical, and it was paid for in lives. Zemke and his senior pilots, like Robert S. Johnson, knew they had to unlearn everything. A new, brutal set of rules was drilled into the group. The first and most important: you do not, under any circumstances, try to turn with a German fighter. Maintain your energy, maintain your speed. If you are attacked, you do not turn to face him, you dive. Use the P-47's 7 tons of mass to plunge away at speeds your opponent cannot possibly match. Escape. Convert that speed back into altitude and re-engage from a position of superiority. It was counterintuitive. It felt like running away, and it went against every instinct of a fighter pilot. But it was the only way to survive. At first, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe their luck. Their combat reports from the spring of 1943 described the enormous American fighters as fat, ponderous, and easy prey. Veteran aces like Georg Peter Eder noted the P-47 was a pig at low altitude, a sitting duck in a turning fight. But then the tone of their reports began to change. Frustration crept in. German pilots would describe getting a Thunderbolt perfectly lined up in their sights, only to watch it nose over and simply fall away, accelerating into a dive so fast it seemed to defy physics. They gave it a new name: the Blitzschnell-Taucher, the lightning-fast diver. Soon after, the P-47s weren't just diving to escape. They were diving to attack, appearing out of the sun from 30,000 feet, their 8.50 caliber machine guns blazing, and then vanishing below before a defense could even be mounted. The hunt had been reversed. As the 56th and other new P-47 groups mastered these boom and zoom tactics, the results became undeniable. On missions where Thunderbolts provided escort, bomber losses plummeted. They weren't flying a close defensive screen, weaving between the B-17s as the RAF might have done. Instead, they flew an offensive sweep, a high screen thousands of feet above the bomber's stream. They were the predators, actively hunting the German fighter formations, diving on them to break up their attacks long before they could get into firing range of the bombers. The P-47 was proving its worth not as a duelist, but as a high-altitude guardian. And in that role, the Thunderbolt's greatest perceived weakness, its sheer size and weight, was revealed as its most profound strength: survivability. The massive, air-cooled radial engine was a fortress. It could absorb cannon shells and flak damage that would cause the liquid-cooled engines of a Spitfire or a Bf-109 to fail catastrophically in seconds. Pilots began returning to base in aircraft that seemed impossible to fly. They came back with entire cylinders blown off their engines, with wings and fuselages riddled with gaping holes from 20-millimeter cannon shells. This incredible toughness gave its pilots a psychological edge. They had the confidence to be hyper-aggressive, to dive into formations of enemy fighters, knowing their jug could take a punch, and more often than not, bring them home. The Thunderbolt had answered its critics. It had dominated the Spitfire in a high-altitude contest. It had outsmarted the Luftwaffe with a new and lethal doctrine. It had proven it could protect the bombers and break up enemy attacks. The aircraft had been vindicated, but it could only do so for a short time. After escorting the bombers for a few hundred miles, the P-47s would reach the limit of their fuel. One by one, they would be forced to turn back, leaving the bombers alone for the most dangerous part of their journey, deep into the heart of Germany. The problem was no longer performance. It was range. The Thunderbolt's newfound success created an immediate and paradoxical crisis. It was so effective that bomber commanders now demanded its protection all the way to targets deep inside Germany. But the fighter simply didn't have the fuel. The solution was not a redesigned airframe, but a piece of expedient battlefield engineering: the drop tank. Early versions, adapted from British designs, were crude, pressurized tanks made of plastic-impregnated paper, often unreliable. But through constant refinement in the field, these were replaced by standardized metal tanks mounted under the fuselage and wings. This single crucial adaptation transformed the P-47 from a regional guardian into a strategic, long-range predator. Now, with extended range, a lethal doctrine, and an almost indestructible airframe, the 8th Air Force was finally ready. The mission was no longer just to protect the bombers. It was to hunt the Luftwaffe to extinction. The climax arrived in the last week of February 1944. A massive, coordinated assault, codenamed Big Week, designed to shatter German aircraft production before the Normandy invasion. This was the moment every element came together. Vast armadas of over 1,000 heavy bombers flew deep into the Reich, escorted by hundreds of long-range P-47s. Flying high on their turbo-superchargers, the Thunderbolts used their drop tanks for the long journey in, then jettisoned the empty tanks, instantly transforming from cruisers into pure fighters. They were now acting on new, brutally simple orders from the 8th Air Force commander, General Jimmy Doolittle. His directive was clear. Fighter pilots were released from their close escort duties. Their primary mission was now to seek out and destroy the enemy. This was no longer a defensive screen. The P-47 pilots were unleashed as hunters. They dove through the German fighter formations, breaking up their attacks before they could begin. They chased the Luftwaffe back towards their own airfields, strafing them as they tried to land and refuel. For 6 straight days, the skies over Germany became a vast, rolling battlefield. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its factories, and it was systematically dismantled. In less than a week, the German fighter force lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots and aircraft, a blow from which it would never recover. The industrial heart of the Reich was now exposed, and the plane once dismissed as a clumsy, overweight failure had become the instrument of air supremacy over Europe. So we return to that British test pilot in late 1942, climbing from the cockpit of the 7-ton milk bottle. His damning assessment was not wrong, it was simply incomplete. He judged the aircraft against the only standard he knew, the nimble, low-altitude interceptor needed to defend the British Isles. He was looking for a better scalpel, but the Americans, facing a different war, had built a sledgehammer. This story is not about one nation being right and another wrong. It is a crucial lesson in military innovation. A weapon's true potential is often invisible until the doctrine and the reality of the battlefield finally catch up to its design. The British needed a defender. The Americans needed an aggressor that could fight a brutal war of attrition miles above the earth and bring its pilot home. The 7-ton sledgehammer that experts swore couldn't climb not only broke the back of the Luftwaffe, it ended up owning the sky.